Luther's theology may indeed be an in-depth theology which makes a theological therapy possible. What the psychologists call the nuclear self, Luther calls the inmost self. And his theology aptly shows how it is healed in justification. I believe that a theological therapy can encompass the internal deep self and the extended social self, where the superego, the ego, and the id of psychoanalysis leave out the relational aspect of reality that is so necessary for healing. Theologically, these ego states can be replaced by Luther's account of the four forums. Let me just be crass, because the plural of the Latin word forum should be fora, but I'll say forums. The forums are the places where we relate with each other. Luther describes four: the forum before God, before ourselves, before others, and before the world. In Latin, coram Deo, coram me ipso, coram hominibus, and coram mundo. One time, struggling with self-knowledge, I also came to the awareness that I was not only the person I thought I was, that I also had to take into account how other people saw me, and that what I thought of myself, or how others might want to define me, didn't matter if it was not how God defined and created me. Thus, I have already touched on three forums, and for me, only a person's image in the world was missing. In the coram relationships, the truth of our very being experiences the encounter of our becoming known by God, by ourselves, by others, and by the world. The four coram relations, before God, before oneself, before others, and our image in the world, again, transcend and have a wider scope than ego states like the superego, the ego, and the id, which are only intra-psychic. The coram relations would be analogous to them, however, for Luther's in-depth theology. Each coram relation places the person in a form of existence and evaluation, the forums ranging from the internal into the external. The Latin preposition coram means before, but most often used in the biblical Hebrew, it is derived from being before the face of, existing in the eyes of, in the sight of, either God, oneself, others, or the world. Gerhard Ebeling has an important chapter in his book, Luther, An Introduction to His Theology, explaining these coram relations as the heart of how Luther's theology opens directly into life experience. Coram Deo is one's existence in the eyes of God, how one is seen by God, how one lives before the face of God. Ebeling has a whole rhapsody of insights about what goes on in the face. If God's eyes go down, we know God disapproves of us, and that constitutes our conscience. Is our conscience defined only by how others look at us? We can save face, lose face, fall on our face. Someone can even turn his or her face away, that is, turn his or her back toward us. These four coram relations take place in forums. They are not mutually exclusive relations because the person is in all of them at one and the same time, simultaneously. Sometimes one has to turn one's back on others, coram hominibus, to set one's face toward God, coram Deo. But to live coram Deo is to respond to the needs of others, coram hominibus. For some people, the coram hominibus is determinative because of peer pressure, keeping up with the Joneses. We let others define our existence. In this respect, those living in the eyes of God have a distinct advantage. Importantly, we also exist in our own eyes, coram me ipso. For some of us, this form is very weak, and our self-definition derives almost completely from our living in the eyes of others. Bismarck is said to have had a strong coram me ipso, a self-image. Perhaps when he introduced universal health coverage back in the 1800s and unemployment insurance or perhaps other legislation, the Parliament would go off into a tirade of noisy protest. He would take out the newspaper, read it until the ruckus was over, and then continue with his speech. Interestingly enough, we do not see and know ourselves the way God does. We are naked in the eyes of God because God sees the heart. Self-knowledge follows after God's knowledge of us. It takes real time, and it is difficult to attain. Hence we learn to know ourselves fully, even as by God we have already been fully known. 1 Corinthians 13. I submit that these coram-relations, these forums, because of their spiritual and relational character, hold real promise for Luther's in-depth theology and therapy. Now, if you become aware of these coram-relations, then you will find them very helpful and easily thought in your everyday experience.